Welcome everybody to Compost, how to build the soil sponge. And we're really excited to talk about this because soil is one of the most important things to those of us here at G3. This is how the discussion is going to go. First, we're going to talk about why compost, very important. And then we'll talk a little bit about the soil party, which is the way that soil works. We'll take a look at your soil in particular. What are some of the conditions and things that you need to know about your soil before you start bringing in compost? Then we'll talk about the different kinds of compost, how you actually can make compost yourself. We'll discuss sheet composting, which is also called sheet mulching sometimes. It's kind of one and the same. And it's used in pretty much every project that we have where we are transforming landscapes from turf to other kinds of landscapes. It's a super important process for soil building. And then finally, we'll talk about a bunch of different ways that we can actually get this compost in the ground. What are some good tips for making sure that it is incorporated in the best way possible? So without further ado, let's move on. Now, first, I want to remind you that everything we talk about comes from this idea of your property is a mini watershed. And what we mean by that is a watershed's an area of land where all the water that falls on it and all the water that's under it drains to the same place. And this gives us that definition gives us a framework for looking at every single property and deciding what are the things that we could do on this property to make this mini watershed actually function a lot better. And in order to do that, we take a look at our property and we see where does the water fall on it first? That's the roof. And where does the water leave the property? That's often, a driveway or a walkway or something. And everything in between those 2 points, you get to make choices about, you get to improve. And here are 4 principles that you can use in order to improve your own mini watershed. The first principle is we grow healthy living soil that acts like a sponge. And that's really what tonight is all about. It's totally soil centric. And by the way, soil is the most important thing that you can be thinking about in your landscape. The second thing is we select climate appropriate plants. Now, there are many Mediterranean plants that are appropriate for Southern California. And in your particular area, the local native plants are actually the very best plants that you can use in your landscape, but that doesn't mean they're the only plants that you can use. The third is passively capturing rainwater as a resource. That means that we are going to actually contour the landscape a little bit, no flat yards anymore. We're going to contour it to hold on to rainwater in the soil for the benefit of the plants. And then finally, we're going to use highly efficient supplemental irrigation only when necessary. Highly efficient irrigation comes from the equipment having been manufactured properly and the system being designed, installed, and maintained properly. And then this only when necessary part really means that we're irrigating because the plants need it, not just because it's Tuesday. So we get a handle on how to actually work with our irrigation timer and really understand, how the plants need water. So these are the 4 important things for us to think about when we are improving our mini watershed. And Living Soil Sponge is the place we're going to spend tonight. Now, something that I want to talk about really before we get into all of this is to help you understand that plants are actually really in control of their environment. Sort of doesn't seem that way because we've kind of evolved landscapes to think, oh, we constantly have to be adding things, water and fertilizer and all these other things. But actually, plants don't need really very much of that. They, especially if we use climate appropriate plants, they have adapted to the environments in which they live, but also they have a biological mandate to re-engineer the soil that they are in to make it as accommodating for them as possible. And what they do is they actually are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and using the carbon portion of that. Of course, they put the oxygen back out and they hold on to the carbon and they use that carbon to essentially build their bodies. So that's how they make, new leaves and branches and fruit and flowers. But they also take some of that carbon and they push it down into their root zone and out through their roots in a liquid form. And they push it into the soil in order to attract a whole microbial community that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But that microbial community uh, works with the plant to actually convert the soil into a very hospitable environment for that plant, making it easier for the plant to get nutrients, easier to get water, and easier really to have a happy life. So this is a kind of important thing for us to understand, that the plants are in control of all of this. And we are just trying to find ways to sort of help them along, if you will. Okay, so why do we need compost? Well, it's pretty clear why. This is a great picture of Oklahoma in 1936. We have, I think all of us heard about this thing called the Dust Bowl, but I don't think we really understand what happened during the Dust Bowl. Essentially, soil had been so thoroughly degraded that it became airborne. It no longer had any kind of structure, and so it became airborne. And these massive dust clouds covered large portions of the United States. In fact, even though this says Oklahoma, in 1936, the dust cloud covered all the way to Washington, D.C. from Oklahoma. So it is it's a really stark reminder, this picture is, of what it looked like, back then when we didn't treat soil very well and we didn't really care very much about having healthy soil. But guess what? This is 2016, and I could probably show you pictures from 2024 as well, all throughout the country. In fact, there's a hashtag AZ dust storms if you're interested in learning more about these terrible dust storms. It's still happening. And the reason is that even though we may have learned some lessons from the Dust Bowl in the 30s, we don't universally apply them, and we don't treat our soils as kindly as we should, especially in urban environments. So it's, even though we talk about degraded soil, as though it's something from the past, we should really recognize that this is an ongoing challenge, and it's something that all of us need to contribute to resolve, because we can't live if our air is filled with this many pollutants. One of the reasons that we want to use compost is it actually allows the soil to hold 26 to 34% more water. So just an inch of compost dramatically alters the way the soil is able to hold on to moisture. And that's probably one of the main reasons why we don't see dust storms when we have really good, healthy soil. What we are looking at here is an example of something called soil structure. And I want to, I'm just trying to move this thing out of my view here. Compost actually helps us create really good soil structure. Soil structure is how the soil behaves, or it's an example of how the soil behaves when water is placed on it or it's put into water. And in this particular example, what you see are two fields or two areas where soil was gathered from, and it was gathered from two spots in each field. So the ones on the left, the two on the left, are different from the two on the right. But you can see here that there are some people that have these clumps of soil in the water and those containers look clean. Like, how is that possible? And yet the containers right next to them are completely dirty. And in fact, the woman here in the foreground in blue has her hand out of the water because the clump is completely dissolved in the water. What's going on here? Well, this is called a slake test, and it is demonstrating how soil that has really good spongy structure actually holds together when there's water and doesn't completely dissolve. Whereas soil that has been degraded because it's been compacted, or maybe it's been over fertilized or overwatered, that soil may look like a clump when you have it in your hand, but when you put it into water, it completely dissolves. It has no structure like a sponge. So I think this is a really easy way to see, yeah, we want soil that has structure. It's a way to eliminate flooding, and it's a way to hold on to more water in dry times. Now, this soil structure is, I thought these pictures might be very helpful because this soil structure is actually created by the soil microbes that are being fed by the roots of those plants. Remember, I told that story in the beginning, and I said there's this whole soil party going on. Well, what are they doing? Well, they are actually excreting glues and other substances that glue together the particles of the soil, and their movement in the soil uh, and working together, eating each other and all kinds of stuff. All of that activity is actually changing the shape of the particles in the soil. And the glues that they have in their system will actually bind together to create these what are called micro aggregates, little teeny tiny aggregates that you can really kind of see in the top. And you can, the top picture, and you see all these roots going through it. This is showing that those roots are really taking advantage of the soil structure, but they are also helping to build it because remember, they're putting that carbon into the soil for those microbes to feast on. So it's a very special relationship where the microbes and the plants are working together to create what you see at the top. And at the bottom, you see a picture that is a high magnification of what one of these macro aggregates looks like, which is where all the little micro aggregates are also kind of glued together. And so this is really how actual sponge is created in the soil. And it makes a huge difference when you have compacted soil that doesn't have any oxygen, doesn't have the right amount of water, and doesn't have any of this soil life in it. We get compaction, and compaction is basically soil that's devoid of oxygen. And you can see in a compacted soil, that plant is never going to be able to put roots down through that compaction. It's very, very difficult for that plant to stay hydrated. The plant on the left is very unhappy. Whereas when you have soil that, we call free draining, but this is actually soil that has structure to it, and you don't have that compaction, you can see my root depth is a lot longer. And when my root depth's longer, I have a lot better capacity to withstand drought conditions. I'm a much happier plant. So this whole symbiotic relationship between microbes and plants is super important, and the plants grow better when they're able to tap into microbial activity. And so really, I mean, we can start to think about plants as like the original carbon farmers, if you will. They are ongoing. It is their life's work to build this soil structure, work with the microbes, and hold on to as much water as they possibly can because they don't know when they're going to get it next. And also release water slowly if there's torrential rains and all the soil is filled with water. It will actually help to release that water slowly so that we don't have flooding and so forth. So this is really, one of the most important things that we want to do. And that's why we want to think about compost. Now, I kept mentioning this thing called the soil party. So I thought it might be interesting for us to explore this just a little bit more to understand who's at the soil party and how do we help them do their job. So the soil party is really kind of shorthand for this massive biological activity that's going on in with plants, and really in a teaspoon of healthy soil from a garden, there are billions upon billions of microbes whose job it is to make that plant happy, most of them anyway. And some of them are really only recently discovered. I mean, this is an ongoing quest in biology to start to name some of these creatures. But it is uh, this group of microbes that are re-engineering the soil and helping the plants to thrive. They live right along the root hairs of the plant. So when and actually I think one of the things that you should try as a little test to see if you've got good biology going on is if you remove a plant from the ground, if you remove a little seedling from the ground, take a look at it. If it has what looks like dreadlocks, on the roots of the plant, this means that there is good biological activity. So all of this biological activity is happening right there at the root zone of the plant. That's where the soil party's happening. It's called the rhizosphere, the root zone. And as I mentioned, the plants are in control. And the thing is, really, the plants are constantly sending out biological signals into the soil, requesting the presence of all the different microbes to perform very specific functions. So the plants know how much, zinc they need, or how much magnesium, or how much nitrogen they need at any given time. And they will actually send out these invitations into the soil, inviting the microbes to come and process the nutrients for them and exchange it for the carbon that they're taking out of the atmosphere. And in the soil, we have this really beautiful cast of characters. So the first and really most basic microbe that we find in the soil are bacteria. Bacteria are always the first to the soil party. They're pretty much everywhere on Earth, and especially in soil. And if there's just a drop of water, it wakes them up and they start their activity, which is predominantly eating. So bacteria love to chomp on pretty much anything. They can actually decompose rock. They start to eat that and they process it into food that they would exchange with the plant. But the problem is that bacteria doesn't really have any way to eliminate. It just keeps filling itself up with more and more nutrient. Another problem with bacteria is they're not incredibly mobile. So they don't have feet, they can't really get around. So if you don't really have a good bacteria population in the soil, that soil needs to be stimulated by something, a wing of a bird maybe, or the proboscis of a butterfly, or maybe a farmer's sole of their shoe, or maybe some compost. But something has to stimulate them to get them going, and also to help them move around. But for sure, if in your soil you've got bacteria eating up all kinds of soil particles and breaking down rock and organic matter and stuff like that, and filling itself up and become nice, juicy bacteria, the next to the party is going to be the protozoa. Protozoa are voracious eaters of bacteria, and they have flagella. So they can swim around in the little bit of water that is this subaquatic environment of the soil. And they will swim around and eat up the bacteria And a really cool thing happens when they eat the bacteria. The nutrient that's inside of the bacteria is actually now released and starts to become available for a plant to take it up. So we need the bacteria in order to unlock the nutrient that I'm sorry, the protozoa to unlock the nutrient that the bacteria have accumulated. And for sure, if you've got nice juicy bacteria and protozoa munching down on them, the next to the party is going to be the nematodes. Nematodes are not all bad. Actually, there are a lot of really good nematodes. And the great news is nematodes are often cannibalistic. And so good guys eat the bad guys all the time. But nematodes are kind of like starting to become the apex predators in the soil microbiome. They can swim around incredibly vigorously and get all over the place. And their favorite foods include protozoa and bacteria besides each other. Uh, and they will actually now start to unlock not only the nutrition that has been building up in the bacteria, but also this accumulated nutrition in the protozoa. And so, for the first time in our soil party, if we're really starting at the very beginning with just degraded soil and only some bacteria there, for the first time now that we have bacteria, protozoa, and nematodes, we actually have plant available nutrient. There's something there that a plant can take up. So, who do you think the next to the party is? Weeds. Yeah, weeds come to the soil party because they're needed. They are needed to heal the soil. Think about it just for a second. The reason that the weeds are there is because the soil party isn't really well developed yet. It's just bacteria, protozoa, and nematodes. There is nutrient cycling, but it's not very sophisticated. The weeds are coming to amp things up. They live and die very, very quickly. They have lots of seeds to spread and multiply themselves. And in their death, in their living and dying, they are actually contributing their bodies to the soil party. I like to think of weeds as pizza delivery guys. Okay, so bear with me here a second. Every party needs pizza, right? So, of course, the soil party needs to have some kind of fuel pizza to keep it going. Well, maybe in the soil, the pizza doesn't exactly look like this. It actually looks like this. So, the pizza for the soil party is organic matter. If you have 100 years to build a garden, you just let the weeds live and die and live and die, and they will eventually make a soil party that's super biodiverse and complex and able to support woody plants and trees and things like that. And the weeds will go away. But most of us don't have 100 years to build a garden. So if we don't want to have weeds be the dominant thing in our landscape, we have to bring in the organic matter so we can bypass the weeds. And the soil party can start to get bigger, feasting on this organic matter. And the organic matter that we are going to be talking about is compost. And for sure, if you add the organic matter, you are going to get fungal growth. And this is a really, really good thing. I know some people who might be new to this topic are thinking fungal growth, that sounds terrible. But actually, in soil, the fungal network is the most important thing that we can possibly have. Fungi, or fungis, as we like to think of them in the soil party, actually create a massive network through which they can share resources, including nutrient and water. They're awesome decomposers of wood. So if you have mulch on your landscape, the fungal network is munching down on that and using it to build the soil structure. And most importantly, if you have planted trees and shrubs that are woody and perennial plants, the fungal network is really what supports those plants and is the thing that makes this garden able to survive changes in temperature, drought, etc. And if you look at your garden and you start to see things that are visible to the eye, like worms, for example, pill bugs, that sort of thing, but especially worms. This is an indicator that the soil party is rocking. It means stuff is going on because worms don't eat, they're not eating roots and things like that. They are actually eating microbes. So if you're seeing lots of worms, it means there's good microbial activity. They have something to do. And so this is an indicator that your soil party is working. And we really want to try to see, as much worm activity as we possibly can. Also, because they make little holes in the ground for water to go in, and their poop is really delicious to other microbes. And when we have this really good soil microbial activity, all of those microbes will actually migrate up onto the plants in our landscape. And they cover every surface. So every leaf, branch, flower, fruit is all covered in this really good biology. And that good biology ends up being an immune system for the plant. It keeps out, invaders, and it also helps the plant to be more resilient, sequester water, carbon, etc., process nutrients. And when the plant drops its leaves or its fruit or its flowers, it's basically returning all of these good microbes and the organic matter right back to the soil party at its roots. And this is really important because eventually we don't want to have to be adding compost all the time. We want to let the plant bring its own pizza to the party. So we're going to feed the microbes in our landscape, not the plants. And we're going to feed them compost, which is a completely decomposed organic matter that looks like soil, smells good, has a dark color, and can actually be used as a soil amendment. In other words, you can put it in the ground around the plant. We're also going to bring what I like to think of as sort of, frozen pizza for the future, and that is mulch. Mulch is also decomposed plant material, but just not decomposed as much. It might just be, it was just chipped up, let's say. And when you look at it, you can see what it used to be. Oh, it's leaves, it's twigs, etc. You can't tell in compost, but in mulch you certainly can. And when it's finely chopped like that, it can be used as a soil cover and kept to a depth of 3 to 4 inches. It holds in moisture and it provides organic matter for the future for those microbes to chew on once they have actually digested all the organic matter that you've added through the compost. So compost and mulch go together. All right, well, what's going on in your soil? Well, the question really is, do you have a brick or a sponge? And I'm pretty sure that many of you are thinking to yourself, yeah, I pretty much have a brick. And that's because you have compacted soil. Uh, Spongy soil is something that you might be blessed with, and if you are truly blessed. But most of us are dealing with a situation where we have a brick or sometimes a sieve, but usually it's a brick. The other thing that we want to try to figure out is what is the soil type? Because actually the soil type sort of helps us to understand why we have a brick. Clay soils are easier to compact. Often when we have clay soils, we end up with bricks. But don't get me wrong, you can actually have a brick and have sandy soil. So in some ways, soil type doesn't matter that much, but it is kind of good to know because a lot of the guidance that is given in plant selection and garden making comes down to the type of soil that you have. So you can do a USDA hand test for soil. You just use a search engine, USDA search for hand test for soil, and hand test for soil texture or soil type. You will determine whether or not you have sand, silt, or clay. I love the gal in the green glasses in this picture, or the green gloves in this picture, because it sort of looks like she doesn't care whether she has sand, silt, or clay at all. So the soil texture is determined by particle size. And what that means is clay soils are very, very tiny. They have characteristics. It's hard to get water into them and it's hard to get water out of them. they dry and drain very, very slowly. Whereas sand particles are actually quite large, relatively, and water goes through it very, very quickly. And that's actually a bit of a problem because water will actually bypass the root zone of the plants. There's nothing holding it all together, and it dries out very, very quickly. So those are sort of the two opposite ends of the spectrum, and silt is kind of in the middle. And the question here of which is best is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question, because there's no such thing as best soil type. They're all good, and we can turn all of them into sponges. Now, a quick way that I want to help you remember the characteristics of sand and clay is by thinking about them as though they're drinks. So sandy soil is like having an iced coffee, where you've got a glass filled with these giant ice cubes, and when you pour the coffee into it, it just goes in super fast. You put a straw in and suck out that coffee. The ice cubes don't come with it, and the coffee comes out really, really fast. Next thing you know, it's an empty glass. That is sandy soil. That's how sandy soil behaves. But clay soil is more like an iced blended coffee, where the ice and the coffee have been blended together and they're really stuck together. When you try to pour ice blended coffee into a glass, what happens? It's like clump, 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 right? It all sticks together very slow. If you were saying, oh, I'm just getting the coffee in there, you'd be like, it'd take forever to do it. And when you put a straw in there and you try to suck out just the coffee, it's very challenging. It takes a really long time. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because the straw is actually just like the root of a plant trying to access water. So in the clayey soils, there will be water that's in the soil attached to the particles of clay. You just can't get it out because it's too stuck to the clay particles. Now, remember I said you have a brick or a sponge? Well, one of the tests that you want to do is this test for compaction. And the test for compaction is essentially digging a hole in the ground. And by the way, this is in the materials that we have where we talk about how to do this. But you dig a hole, you fill it with water, and then you measure how quickly does the water drain out of this hole. And if you get results where the water is draining out of the hole 2 to 4 inches an hour, this is great news. That's perfect soil, really. But if it's any slower than 2 inches an hour or any faster than 4 inches an hour, you definitely have to add compost. The picture on the right is using a soil probe to see what's going on down below the ground. I highly recommend you get a soil probe to figure out what's going on in your soil. All right, let's talk about compost itself. It was a big lead up to compost, right? Well, of course, you can always buy compost. Certainly, you can buy it in bags, or you can buy it in bulk, in which case truck will come and dump yards of compost. Yards are cubic yards, and it's 3 cubic feet squared, essentially, is a yard. Or you can make it, and making it is a lot of fun and is actually pretty easy to do. It's a great thing to be doing in pretty much every situation. So we're going to go through a couple ways that you can make compost. Compost is really all about a balance. It's a balance between carbon and nitrogen. Carbon is represented by brown material, so dead leaves, paper, things that are actually brown, dry material. Nitrogen is represented by pretty much everything else. It's the green material. And the thing is that the balance between the carbon and the nitrogen is important because this is going to determine how quickly the entire thing breaks down. You need both of them for a good compost pile. You also need aeration. Oxygen is a critical thing because you want to have aerobic decomposition, meaning the microbial activity that's going on in the compost pile is dominated by oxygen. And then finally, water is super essential because it has to be moist. You won't have decomposition without water. So green, brown, oxygen, and water. The browns, as I said, are the carbon. And generally for a healthy compost pile, you're going to need at least 50% of the compost pile to be brown. Leaves are a good material, dried grass, even shredded paper, as you see here, or wood shavings. These are all really good sources of brown material. And then the green material, as I said, is going to be the more fresh material. So this is your kitchen scraps. It's green grass. It's things like coffee grounds and even seaweed. If you're in a situation where you can get seaweed that can be washed off. All of these things are green. You don't want to have more than 50% of the pile green, nitrogen. So your browns are a minimum of 50%, and your greens are a maximum of 50%. One thing that is, I think, really good to keep in mind is, especially if you are going to be using your kitchen scraps, is finding a counter collection system, something on top countertop that you can put it into that keeps it from getting bugs and so forth. And then you can actually dump that into a plastic bag or into a, some kind of bag or container and freeze it. And that way you don't have to have it out all the time on your countertop, and you can wait until you get a good amount to take it out to the compost bin. It's fine if it's all frozen. You want to make sure, as I said, that you have oxygen and water. These are really important. So you want to have access to pitchfork or something that can help you turn the compost, and you want to make sure you have access to a hose. And here are the layers really of how we build the compost. And it's actually quite simple, and it's made super complicated. We're going to talk about a little bit of a twist in a minute, but at its fundamental steps, it's pretty easy to do. You start by building the compost pile on bare earth is really the best way to go. That's because there's all these microbes and things in the soil that'll migrate up into the compost. So you don't really have to do much more than that. But if you do start it in something else where it doesn't have ground contact, you're going to want to take a couple shovelfuls of the native soil and throw it into the compost like a starter, kind of like when you're making your sourdough. You're going to want to lay brown material, twigs, straw, etc., down on the ground, the stuff that's dry, and then start to layer on top of that. So a little bit of green, a little bit more brown, watering in between each layer and covering the whole thing with some kind of tarp or cover to retain the moisture that is in the pile. Now, after you've got a couple of these layers going, you're going to want to make sure that you have a way to turn the pile to keep the oxygen in the pile. And if you really want to boost the effectiveness of your compost pile, add red wigglers, add worms into the compost, and it will increase the productivity of the pile. You certainly could use a tumbler, like something like this, where you're not building it right on the ground, but you are going to need that starter garden soil to get the microbial activity going. And essentially, it's the same thing. You're going to be adding brown and green material, alternating between the two, and making sure that after each addition, you're putting in some water to make sure that it's moist, but also you're going to keep tumbling it regularly. That's how the oxygen gets into it. And when you have a tumbler like this, the best thing is to keep it in a shady area. Why? Because the plastic material heats up. And yes, it's good to have heat in a compost pile, as you're about to see in a slide or two, but it gets too hot and it can actually kill the material, the good guys that you're trying to grow on the inside here. And make sure that every now and again, And how frequently is that? I don't know, once a week, once every couple of weeks. You throw another little bit of garden soil into the mix to keep those good microbes going. The finished compost is pretty easy to remove from these things. And you're going to want to remove it, keep checking on it and remove it regularly, because if it gets too full, it is tough to turn. It can be very, very heavy. There is something called a passive pile, which is a cold compost. And cold compost means you're not turning it on a regular basis. This passive system is sort of lazy person's compost, I guess they call it. We're basically going to allow the pile to build up, and we have to be really careful that we don't get too much brown in this and that we don't get too much green either. So you're really keeping an eye on making sure it's like a 50-50 mix as you build it up. And you just let it sit. That's it. You add water to it pretty regularly when you see that it's drying out, especially if there's brown on top. And also, putting worms into this kind of a compost pile is a really great way to boost the accelerate the decomposition. Now, if you're going to do a passive pile, it's kind of important to manage your weeds or your diseased material that's going into the pile. Really, weed seed and diseased material isn't really broken down unless there's some heat. And again, this is a cold pile, so you're going to want to manage that and maybe put it into a green bin or into a bin where it can be taken to a professional composting facility, and they will be able to kill the pathogens and the weed seeds. But for a cold or passive managed pile, it's going to be hard to kill those weed seeds, so just be aware of that. Now, the other alternative is to do what's called thermophilic or hot composting. Hot compost. This sounds delicious. This happens a lot faster. So the cold compost may take a year to actually get something broken down, but in hot composting, you're going to have good compost in 3 to 6 months. And it actually can get hot enough to kill weed seeds. So you don't really need to worry about the stuff that you're putting into this. In this particular case, you're going to want to make sure that you're managing your nitrogen. So here, you're actually going to have, 60% or 70% of the pile is going to be browns, and only about 30% of the pile is going to be nitrogen. You need to have an area that's at least a 3x3 height and also square foot. And you definitely want to keep the compost damp. Now, we recommend that you get a compost thermometer, which is just a very, very long thermometer like what you see here. It allows you to read the temperature of the compost. When the compost gets up to about 155 degrees, then you actually do turn the compost so that it can cool down and you're not building up any kind of like alcohol or any kind of anaerobic decomposition. And so when you turn the pile, it cools it off a little bit, and then the temperature will come up again, and that's when you turn it. So you use the thermometer basically to indicate when you are going to turn the compost. And when it finally cools down after a few turns, you can add worms to it too, and it will make your compost even better. Here's a very quick depiction of how to do what's called a 2-pile system. You're basically going to grow a compost pile, and then you have area already mapped out where your second pile would be placed so that you could turn the first pile. So if you were looking from above at your compost pile, the point here is to make sure that the whole pile is getting moved. You're basically going to have a bottom section, there's kind of this middle section, and then the very top, which is the most recent stuff that you put in. When you turn your pile, you set up your compost area, your second pile basically, next to your first one, and you put down a tarp and take the most recently added stuff out of the compost bin and put it on the tarp. That's the top of the compost bin is going to go on the tarp. And then you set up your, as I said, set up your second pile, and you are now going to take the center of the first pile. So the stuff that's not quite totally decomposed, and that's going to become the bottom of your new pile. After you have the bottom of your new pile set up, you go ahead and take all that stuff off your tarp and throw it onto the next part. It becomes the center of your new pile. And then the stuff that used to be at the bottom goes to the top of your compost pile, or you're just going to go ahead and use a lot of that in your landscape. And frankly, I never allowed my compost to completely decompose all the way down to that good chocolate cake kind of stuff that we showed in previous pictures. I usually used it even when it was still a little chunky. It's perfectly fine in landscape, and it makes it a lot easier. You don't have to throw that stuff back into the compost pile. There's also something called a Johnson-Su bioreactor. This is something that was created by Dr. David Johnson and Hui-Chin Su, his wife. It's really interesting. It's a little bit of hot and a little bit of cold. I recommend that you do a search for a Johnson-Su bioreactor. It'll show you step by step how to make it. But essentially, this is a passive pile. So it's a cold pile. But because you've put these perforated pipes into the pile, it actually accelerates the oxygen getting into that pile, and it heats it up even faster and decomposes it. Into these Johnson-Su bioreactors, worms are always added, and it just becomes a beautiful fungally dominated material. You can see there the picture on the lower right-hand side. It's awesome compost. What happens, when the compost smells? This is an indicator that it's not good compost. If you have smelly compost or too wet compost, you immediately need to add some brown material to it, and you need to oxygenate it. So you're going to need to aerate it by turning it, moving it around. You definitely can add animal waste to compost piles. Usually we don't recommend doing it in urban areas because there are a lot of sort of urban fauna that like to eat animal waste. So it's one of these things, animal parts like the bones and so forth from your kitchen, and also even animal waste. It can attract rodents and so forth. So you want to be careful. You want to know where it comes from if you're using chicken manure, horse manure, or whatever. And if it isn't fully composted, it will smell. So you're going to get it in there. It is a very green material. You definitely want to locate your compost pile away from the house and keep it covered. That way, you really reduce the number of pests. But if it's out in the garden, there are lots of natural predators that will actually be attracted to your compost pile and attracted to the meals that your compost pile is attracting. Rodents are always something you want to keep in mind. A good way to keep them out of your compost bin is to have wire underneath it. Using one of those tumbler bins is a good way because it's entirely closed. If you are really concerned about this, you're going to want to keep meat, fat, and so forth out of the bin. But don't confuse the guy at the top, who is a possum, for a rat. Possums are actually really good creatures to attract to your garden, and they will eat bugs. So you definitely want some of those guys in your garden. If you're not willing to make compost, you can actually use worm castings. They can be purchased also in bulk or in bag. And they are really a fantastic way to boost the organic matter in your garden. They work super fast. But you can also make worm castings. It's called vermiculture. You can even do it indoors or in small spaces. You need to have a container that is enclosed, and you basically create a mini compost pile within the container by adding brown material and making sure it's nice and wet, and then putting the worms into that brown material. Red regulars, which I can't say 10 times fast, is the type of worm that you're going to use for this. Once you have the brown material, moist brown material, and the worms in there, you can go ahead and start adding your kitchen scraps into this. And that kitchen scraps are green waste, nitrogen. They're excellent. They will be eaten by the worms, and the worms leave behind some castings or poo. And they also often have a liquid material that is really good diluted for indoor plants. If you're going to do vermiculture, don't use any animal byproducts in the actual bin. Hugelkultur is another way to compost. And what the heck is hugelkultur? Well, it's mound culture. Here we are essentially mimicking what happens when a tree falls in the forest. When it falls in the forest, it becomes the nurse log for other trees, other plants. They decompose that log and use that organic matter to help them get a good start. And we're basically doing the same thing in the garden by making a mound of organic matter, which is mostly wood material, brown material, covering it with some soil and even some green material like grass clippings and so forth. We make these mounds and then we plant on them. And this is a way to make a very quick raised bed, and it is a legitimate composting technique. Now, you can also purchase uh, microbes or compost tea. You can either make compost tea or you can purchase it. Compost tea is made from microbes that have been put into water and they've been oxygenated. So oxygen's been put through that water. And when you do this process, you can actually turn a 5-gallon bucket of water and compost, really good compost, into as much as 15 gallons of water, which can cover 1,000 square feet with compost tea. And compost tea is a great drench on the leaves and around plants too, especially struggling ones. Actively aerated compost tea is something you can buy kits to do. It essentially is a tea bag of really good compost put into the water with this aeration going on, and it turns into a beautiful material. And here is just a quick picture of how fast these, this is actually fungal activity, how fast it grows. So, starting out with just good compost suspended in water, when you give it oxygen over 24 hours, you get this incredibly dense, fungally excellent material. Another good material for the garden is humates. These you purchase. For the most part, they are a mine product, so you want to be thinking about that. But if you've got struggling plants, they can help a lot. Grass cycling is also a legitimate way of getting organic matter in your landscape. If you have a neighbor who has a lawn, or maybe you still have a little part of lawn, you can take the grass clippings, leave them on the lawn to decompose, or pull them off and use them as the greens for your compost. Chopping and dropping. This is probably my favorite easy way to compost. Every time you prune, you basically keep the organic matter in the garden. You chop it up into little pieces and drop it right at the bottom of the plant. Remember, the plant wants to give itself its own pizza, so this is the best thing you could do for a plant. Certainly investing in a chipper if you have a lot of trees or shrubs, or perhaps you and a neighbor go in on a chipper. It's a great way to keep your organic matter on site. Wow, I am very slow, so I'm sorry. I'm going to cover this pretty quickly. Sheet composting, you can learn more about this in our turf removal classes, but sheet composting is basically a way to build soil and keep down weeds. We add some compost on top of the soil that after we've removed grass, we have soil that is bare and exposed. We put down some compost on top of it. We water everything. And then we roll out paper or cardboard. In some cases, paper is easier to work with, and make sure to overlap it so that there's no, the sunlight can't hit it. And then we cover on top of that a little bit more compost and 3 to 4 inches of mulch. So that's that woody material, making sure to water, every 1 inch that you put down, you continue to water. What are we doing? We're basically doing a massive lasagna, in our front yard or in our yard with all this organic matter, and given enough water, it will actually start to compost in place and it will create a much better soil. Skip the weed fabric, never use weed fabric. It's just a bad deal. It makes weeds. Okay, what's the best way to get compost into the ground? Well, the easy way is nature's way, and that is get the soil party started with compost, but then let the plants drop their own leaf material onto the ground to feed their own soil party. Don't get rid of that organic matter, leave it in place. When we are actually building a garden, we want to make sure that we do minimal disturbance to the soil, because every time we disturb soil, we are actually disturbing that soil party. So if we have to disturb, we only do it once. We can use an auger, which is what you're seeing here, is basically a drill bit, an 18-inch long, 3/8 inch drill bit that is being used to poke holes in the soil. You might want to do something like this if you have an area of your garden that's particularly compacted or isn't draining very well. You can do this and then put compost on top of it, and it will help to aerate the soil and turn it into more spongy material. Even if Matt Damon, look at that picture, doesn't it look like Matt Damon? Even if Matt Damon comes to your house and offers to till your soil, don't do it. Don't disturb that soil party. You want to go gently. So really minimal disturbance. Also, stop using fertilizers. No more fertilizers that have those symbols NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You don't need that. Your garden doesn't need it. Really, there are no plants in a good garden that need that. What you need is compost, and if you have space between your plants, mulch. That is how you replace that fertilizer. Make sure you're managing your irrigation. Really, it's the way to healthy soil is to make sure that there's plenty of oxygen and water in the soil, but not too much of either. And so that means really learning more about how to manage your irrigation. If you have clay soil, definitely you want to cover it with compost and get plants in the ground. If you have sandy soil, the best way to make it more spongy is to add compost and plant a lot of plants. Those plants will really help to create the spongy soil. If you can't, you can't overdo compost or worm castings. They don't have any nutrient in them of themselves. They stimulate the biology to make the nutrient. So you really can't do too much of it. And we are finally at the end. Whenever you're purchasing products for your landscape, make sure that you look for the WaterSense label when you are buying things related to irrigation or related to water. When you see that label, you know that you are able to save up to 20% over an unlabeled product. And also look for WaterSense professionals. These are people who've been trained in many of the techniques that I've talked about tonight, and also in techniques for reducing the water use of your garden. There are many good resources out there. The U.S. Composting Council has great resources. The Natural Resources Conservation Service and also a nonprofit called Kiss the Ground are great resources. Next steps, make sure you check your soil, experiment with some composting, take some classes, and tell your friends. Okay, we have come to the end of our class.
Yeah,
Are there any questions?
A lot of questions, and
Great.
I hope that I answered everyone's questions sufficiently. We've had quite a few questions about resources for professionals in knowledgeable the watershed approach and all of this, I pointed people to APLD, the Find a Designer tool. I think there's, is there a list of G3 certified professionals?
Yes, so the water sense, if you go to water sense, if you just search water sense professionals, there are lists of professionals that have taken certifications, including the G3 certification. And also in all of our written handbooks and so forth, there are URLs for various organizations that can provide you with assistance on all this good stuff. Yeah.
Great. And another question that I wanted to clarify on, because I know you said you were recording this and planning on offering offering a new kind of tier of the classes.
Yes.
Do you have information on that to
You're
share?
going to get a link to that when you at the end of the class. So that's part of the discussion that we had at the beginning about how you're going to get a link with resources and so forth. So there'll be a link to go to it, and it's sponsored by Upper District online. And so you will be able to go there and watch the class again or send your friends to it.
Great. That's a new thing.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
We're
great.
excited about that.
Yeah, very exciting. Other questions, a really good question was placing mulch around wooden fences, and I made you know, that was a really great point to make sure to you know, keep mulch away from wood or the foundation or above the weep screed of your homes, just so you're not welcoming rot or termites. So that's just a good point. Um, and then some other cool, I was really excited to hear somebody is taking out their synthetic turf and wants to activate their soil life, and really just it kept boiling down to the same answer, is that it really is as simple as compost and mulch. And I've seen the magic happen hundreds of times in all different kinds of sites, and it seems like it's too good to be true, but that's really all you need to do.
Yeah,
So
it's
yeah,
amazing, isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah,
It is almost a miracle, really.
yeah.
Well, those sound like some good questions. And is there maybe one more?
Yeah, let's see.
Somebody just raised their hand. I'm wondering if they would
Question
go to the Q&A and ask.
questions about the free compost and mulch programs from the city, as well as an interesting situation of a pool that has been turned into soil, and how the soil sponge can be reintroduced to that. So those are two very different questions, but those were two others that I'm scrolling through that I found interesting.
Yeah, local, really almost every municipality in the country now is doing some kind of composting. I mean, you know, the proliferation of organic matter in our cities especially is really a big deal. And so, yes, you should take a look at your municipal website and see if they have free compost. As I said, many of them do. In California especially, there is a whole push now to keep organic matter out of landfills. And so there's a real desire for people to take the compost, and they've refined the creation of the compost. The standards are actually getting quite high.
Yeah.
So it's good stuff.
Yeah, and I would just say to reserve if you do have a worm bin, like that's the good, in my opinion, that's like the golden stuff that I put on my vegetables, you know, and then maybe the stuff that you're getting from the city, you can put everywhere else. But
Yeah,
I think it's good anywhere.
that is great. Well, it does look like we got great questions. All those questions are going to be put together on to accompany the recording. So we're very excited about that. And we're really glad that you joined us this evening. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, and have a wonderful evening.